Hello and welcome to the official Blasternal blog. Happy New Year to you all. May 2023 hold promises fulfilled for all your ventures. Tonight, I have the privilege of interviewing Mark of the Electric Underground on YouTube. For those of you who don't know, Mark runs a YouTube channel dedicated to the shoot 'em up genre, which we colloquially call shmups in the gaming industry. Here's part one of our interview. Hopefully, it will be the first of several future discussions that Mark and I will have. Please check out Mark's channel, The Electric Underground, on YouTube following this interview. Enjoy! Just to make sure that the audience knows that this is not a paid endorsement for you. I'm not paying you. You're not being coerced. You're speaking frankly from your own opinion. Your opinion
That's
is
right.
yours. And then
That is absolutely right.
And then your opinions don't necessarily, they're your opinions of your own. They're not necessarily reflecting of anybody else's opinion, so on and so forth. They're your own opinions.
Yes. I am the sole CEO of the Electric Underground, so I speak for all of the underground.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that, at least the chore part of it out of the way. I really appreciate that. Just want to CYA on both of our ends. I own a company, and we have a mutual NDA, so we really try to be very careful about.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know how I'm like a very freelancer type person where I remember one time I was talking to, I don't like to do any sort of legal type stuff. And I was talking to this other YouTuber once. I was like, hey, do you mind if I do a parody? And this was not a famous YouTuber, by the way. This is someone who was on the same level as me as terms of viewership. And I was like, hey, I thought it'd be funny if I did a parody of one of your videos. What do you think about that? And he's like, well, I'll need to contact a lawyer. I'm like, okay, never mind.
Wow. Man.
He's like, I just want to make sure it's not illegal or intellectual infringement or some crazy shit.
Oh, wow. Yeesh.
Yeah, right, so you have your way with me.
No, that's fine. I appreciate your time. But just real quick, I'm became a very quick fan of your content. What I really appreciate about your voice, Mark, is that you keep it real and you say the things that other YouTubers don't really. You get into the depths that other YouTubers, I don't think, really get into. They try to have more broad appeal.
Yeah.
And you seem to understand your audience a little bit more. You seem to be a little bit more in tune with the layperson, and you're not necessarily trying to be a brand. And so I think
exactly. I think my audience. I really like my audience, and I think the reason why I have a really different relationship with my audience is because it's really old school how my audience has come together versus a lot of other channels' audiences. A majority of my audience is almost hand recruited, literally person by person. A little bit less these days. These days, the algorithm helps my channel out a little bit more. But getting off the ground, I almost literally knew everyone in my audience to that point. That's how DIY the channel was in the beginning.
Wow.
It was 300 people that I all knew online, and then slowly from there. Wow. It's just a lot more audience interaction, I think, most other channels.
Oh, that's awesome. So with the Electric Underground, how long have you been on YouTube?
I started on... So there's two versions of the Electric Underground. The successful version is the YouTube version. But I think prototype of it, in terms of content, and I still really like this version, there was a podcast SoundCloud version of the Electric Underground. And at the time, I was copying some other podcasts. There was a brief fad for about a few months where podcasters decided SoundCloud was a good idea for some reason. And so I was like, oh, okay, SoundCloud. So I had this I had this podcast on SoundCloud, and that was actually 2 years worth of content. I was podcasting on SoundCloud, but turns out SoundCloud is not a very good podcasting platform because it has absolutely no reach. So that's what I meant. All the people who listen to my SoundCloud podcast, I literally one by one had to contact them and be like, "Here, I have a podcast. Hey, I have a podcast. You want to listen?" So the listenership for that was pretty low compared to what the channel is now. I would get about like 500 per episode, 500 listens per episode, and then like viral episode 2000. I was like, oh my God, I'm getting too. I remember there's an episode where I interviewed the Zero Ranger devs, and I think that ended up around 2000 listens, and I was like, oh my God, I'm getting too famous.
Oh, wow.
The scale is out of control. It's just funny to think about that now, but
Yeah.
so I actually did 2 years of content that probably the majority of my audience doesn't even know exists. It's on my YouTube channel under a playlist, but I just used my YouTube channel as like a ground that I just threw stuff on there just in case.
Gotcha.
But I made the switch when I had the realization that I needed to reach more people it wasn't really feasible to reach more people through podcasting for something so niche because there's no promotional algorithm to help you. And then I thought, okay, YouTube is going to be the way I can do that. And so I made that switch, I think in 2018 is when I swapped over to YouTube. 2019. If it doesn't take up too much of your time, I actually could pinpoint when that occurred.
No, that's fine. Let's take your time.
Okay, I can show you the exact moment that occurred because it was very like, okay, I'm swapping to YouTube now. So I can dig that up in the channel history. Because what ended up happening, how I made that switch while I'm filling the time, is I would, every now and again, I would post content that I was like, I can't really explain this via talking, so I'm going to post it on my YouTube channel just to show people what I'm talking about. And those ended up being slightly popular by my terms. You know, they'd get like, some of them got like 2,000 views, and I was like, oh, okay, so this is much more effective. Okay, so and of course my viral video that I never intended to be a viral video by my standards. So that one was even before I swapped over to YouTube.
Interesting.
So the moment I swapped over to YouTube was when I reviewed Refrain. So where are you, Refrain? 4 years ago. So my Refrain review was the episode was the moment I said, okay, let's try and do some video stuff here.
Gotcha. So it grew legs.
That was four years ago, so 2018.
Gotcha. So you're OG. You grew legs from 2018 on.
Yeah, I started podcasting. Let's figure out when I started podcasting. I think in 2016 or 17. Let's see if I can dig up the original post. This might be a little bit tricky.
While you're doing that, how often do you get interviewed by people?
Every now and again. It's funny because normally it kind of comes in waves. Because this month, I've been on 3 or 4 different interviews, but November and December I wasn't on any. So it just kind of comes and goes.
Okay.
But it's pretty rare that people interview me directly, if that makes sense, because I'm not really all that interesting. Usually I'm kind of like a co-host type or like a guest on a show. I do that pretty frequently, but as far as interviewing my YouTubing career, I think that's happened like 3 times.
Okay, well, I feel honored then.
Well, I think it's cool that you even want to interview me. So
well again,
I think that's cool.
You have a unique approach to you, and we'll get into your love of shmups, but it's just I think the way that you. I'll give you a quick anecdote. I hated high school. I hated everything about like grade school. Everything I did very poorly in like school. But then I went to college.
Did you hate? I'm gonna interview your interview. Did you hate it socially or did you hate it academically?
Academically, the most, because I didn't feel I was learning anything.
And, you probably weren't.
And then
went to public high school?
Yeah.
Probably you didn't.
Yeah.
I went to public high school too. I learned nothing.
Right. And so once I got to college, they started treating me like an adult. Like, you know, I had to be at class. I had to pay for this. And it was just it was like, it was a real metamorphic moment for me, a transformation in my soul and my being. Like, wow, I'm an adult. I can be treated like an adult. People will talk to me and respect me and expect me to have responsibilities. And so I took college much more seriously for that reason. And that's how I see your channel. You're like the college of YouTube, YouTube gamers. You're at the college level.
I think that's a good comparison because I'll start to wade into territories that it does feel like literally people will start bringing up, well, in college we talked about this, and it's like, okay. Yeah, so I can kind of, some people have even said like, oh, I'm writing some kind of thesis about this or whatever. So
yeah.
I've heard that a few times, that it can kind of wade into sort of a collegiate sort of feel at times.
Yeah, there's an academic bent to it. You have a debonair sort of intellectual, laid back intellectualism, but it's certainly there, and that's what really makes you, in my opinion, stand out from the crowd. Nothing wrong with the other channels, of course, but yours tends to be a lot more academic in how you see things. You break things down and give it talk about anatomy of things, and that's my background is in computer code, so it's important to understand systems and how things relate. And you lay that sort of stuff out and you orate that. That's not necessarily easy either, because to go from brain to mouth in a very academic way, that's a gift. So
yeah, I think that comes from, part of it comes from, because I have a background in shmups specifically and talking about shmups. So shmups, I guess my little rant here is, I think most game reviews and most sort of gaming media content these days actually does not discuss gaming as in terms of its design all that much. It's more about like gaming in sort of a cultural sense. So like a review, like there's a great example of this is go read a bunch of Bayonetta 3 reviews. They will give the most glossy mention to mechanics in those reviews. To be like, yeah, there's summons or some shit. Anyway, so Bayonetta, or whatever.
Right.
A lot of gaming journalism and gaming media has drifted away from talking about I guess the more boring shit or whatever, the more academic shit of what does the change in the summoning system, how does that affect the combat? How does it affect the level design? How does that affect enemy AI plays? How does that all come together gameplay wise? And I think that comes from covering shmups, because if you look at a lot of sort of mainstream reviews of shmups, they actually do not know what to say about the genre. So it's kind of funny if you go and read a lot of old school cave reviews and stuff. They kind of talk about the history of shmups. That's always really common. So if you read a shmup review, say in 1999, the arcade, Smokey in the quarter munching, and they'll talk about arcades. But outside of the greater context of shmups, they don't really talk specifically, okay, why is Dodonpachi different from Dodonpachi DOJ? What's the separation between these two games?
Right.
You actually won't be able to tell from those reviews. So that was kind of my goal early on, is I'm going to try to explain to you the exact differences between these games. And because shmups are such a technical genre, I kind of figured out that style of review, and then I thought, oh, wouldn't that be interesting if I started applying this to somewhat more mainstream stuff? Like I talk about Castlevania and talk about the iframes and the jump mechanics and how the jump works and all that stuff, level design. So that's kind of where it comes from.
Well, let me say this. I grew up in the golden age. I'm going to say for the record, I was born in 1970, so I'm literally old school. I'm 52 years old now. I still enjoy the idea of games, and this is not an interview about me, but just a real quick primer is that when you talk about shmups, that was the actual, people don't understand, shmups were the benchmark of all other games. Every console, every arcade
the premium
board,
genre.
Yeah, it was. It was the thing that made the arcades the most money, because they were the things that killed you fastest and got you off the machine quickest. And so every other game genre owes its salt to the shmups that were tuning the hardware. It was tuning the game, not only the hardware, but that's coupled to where your thesis comes in, the gameplay, what the Twitch reaction is, how quickly does it respond to people. That sort of laziness of Mario, where when I say laziness, you jump and you slide a little bit, and that's part of the game mechanic, right? Well, that's gonna get you killed in a shmup.
Yeah. There's that. With the more intensity of the gameplay, it requires more precision in the mechanics.
And that's
so
what
I've talked about this in that inertia video specifically, where the problem with inertia outside of just, game feel and all that sort of thing is that it presents a fundamental problem to the genre because in order to make inertia make sense, which is basically inertia, however you want to define it, is adding additional delay to your controls artificially. In order to make that make sense, you have to. There's no other way. You have to reduce the intensity of the game design. So you have to make the bullets slower. You have to make the patterns more sparse because otherwise you can't actually navigate that. And
Right.
so with a lot of the mainstream stuff, like Super Mario, for example, they're not as intense, so they can get away with a lot more in terms of sort of the mechanics. So they can throw some inertia on Mario. Well, Mario's not all that intensive a game, so if Mario slides around a little bit, whatever. But
you got
with
it.
shmups, they have to get that right. They have to make it as responsive and precise as possible, because otherwise you're dead.
Now, Kaneko makes a game, Airbuster, and it really surprised me when I went to the space levels, and there was that. Are you familiar with that title, Airbuster,
Huh?
by Kaneko?
Now, let me make sure I'm not getting my busters mixed up here.
It's
Sometimes
it's
I'll do-
old school
I'll
arcade.
sometimes, I'll sometimes do that.
It's old school. It is real old
Yes.
school arcade.
Yes. Okay, I'm seeing it right now.
Give it a play.
Yes, I'm seeing it.
Yeah, give it a play sometimes. And I guess I spoiled it for you. When you get to the space levels outside of the atmosphere, they add inertia to your play, and it's becomes part of the mechanic. You start owning. So what they did was it leveled up in difficulty. They added it as a game mechanic. Now you're in space, and now there's no air friction, and so you press up, and if you let go, there's still a little bit of inertia on your ship, and you've got to deal with that as part of the gameplay. It's really brilliant how they did it, and I haven't really
another example of that we don't really think about, but it's super obvious, is ice stages in platformers.
Yes,
That's the same thing. They're
exactly. You're right.
Well, let's add. I was playing a shmup, and I think it was Sisters Royale, and it had an ice stage in it. I'm like, you motherfucker. but yeah, it makes sense if you want to add it in as some sort of environmental hazard. I think that makes sense, but you obviously have to adjust the level design along with it.
Right,
You'll notice in ice stages and a lot of platformers, they don't have like really precise platforming in those stages because it would be crazy hard to do that.
Right. What got you into games in general, games in general, and then shmup specifically? Just real quick on that.
Like how I started gaming, just generally, or
just we're trying to get an entry into what got you to shmups.
Oh, okay. So my gaming career is a long road from my life gaming to playing shmups, because I didn't play shmups as a kid, other than Raiden. So as a kid, what got me into gaming was my Super Nintendo. I guess that's really, really typical. And the game that I played on Super Nintendo all day long was Super Metroid. So that was like my very first real game, I would say. And I still really love Super Metroid. And the SNES stuff, and Genesis. So a really typical introduction to gaming, I would say. And I don't think my gaming taste particularly stood out that much growing up or anything, other than I was starting to do things that my friends were kind of weird. Like, for example, I remember in middle school, I had my friend come over and I said, okay, we're going to play Super Mario Bros. 3, but we're going to play it with a new rule. The rule is if you die, you have to reset the game completely. So I started doing shit that kind of, like, this was before watching shit on YouTube or anything. It was just kind of naturally, because I started beating these games pretty easily or pretty confidently, I decided, okay, we got to kind of make up some rules here to make them more interesting. So I'd start to do things like, okay, we're playing Super Mario Bros., but if you die, you have to reset the entire game and no warp whistles. You have to play through the entire game without dying. And then I'd start doing that with other games, platformers, Donkey Kong Country, sometimes with fighting games, and that was brutal, like Street Fighter 2 or something, trying to do that, do a no-death Street Fighter. So I kind of picked up on no-death stuff, and then I kind of did some really early speedrunning, but that sounds more impressive than it was. But what I would do is I would go on, because I played Super Metroid all the time, and I'd go on GameFAQs and read, oh, this is how you speed or mock ball. This is how you sequence break. And then I watched this. It wasn't even on YouTube. I don't know if you remember BearShare. It's like this peer-to-peer
Yes.
file sharing. Yeah, so on BearShare, there was a Super Metroid speedrun of a I think he's a Mexican speedrunner. I'm just judging by his name. His name is Smokey Rodriguez. And it blew my mind when I saw this guy speedrunning Super Metroid. So I kind of tried it. Basically, my strategy was just to copy his replay, this video. And he was like mock balling and doing all these speed booster things and sequence breaking. And so I was kind of doing that before I even knew speedrunning was like a wider thing that people did. So, but there's a big break in there. So I was kind of doing that in middle school. And then high school, I decided I liked gaming, but I wanted to have a girlfriend. So I became a very, very closeted gamer, as in literally closeted, as in if I invited my friends over, my cool friends, or a girl over, I would run, grab my Nintendos and shit and PlayStations and hide them in the closet. So I'd literally be a closeted gamer because I'd be like, oh, fuck. Girls coming over. So I'd run over, grab my shit, and like put it in the closet. Be like, oh, what? Games? And then I would even do, this might piss off some people who are sensitive about this, but I would even like pretend I didn't know what gaming was when I'd go over to a friend's house and they'd be playing, and like their little brother would be playing StarCraft. I loved StarCraft. And they'd be like, oh, look at this nerd playing StarCraft. I wouldn't be mean, but I'd be like, StarCraft? What's StarCraft? Meanwhile, the weekend, I'm playing Brood War all weekend, late into the night. I'd go over to the friends and be like, StarCraft? Oh, yeah, I've never even heard of that. What is that? So I kind of did that for all of high school. I was much more closeted about it. And then in my early years of college, I didn't game too much, but I got really, really into the Metal Gear series. To the point, I guess kind of like with Super Mario 3, where I would start doing shit that wasn't necessary. Like, one year I swear I played Metal Gear Solid 3 16 times or something in one year. And I just kept playing it on European Extreme mode, and I had this rule where if I got caught, I would reset the save. So I got like really into Metal Gear Solid 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2. And I played them quite a lot in college. And then the turning point, though, where I got more into gaming again, was I never got a PS3 on launch. My little brother had one, and he played COD, and my brothers were actually really good at COD and really good at first-person shooters. And so I never got a PS3, but I had this weird affection with my PS2, I guess because of Metal Gear and stuff. So I went to a retro game shop, and I was just buying random PS2 games, and I bought Virtua Fighter 4 on the PS2, and the game blew my mind. And so I got really into Virtua Fighter 4, but no one played it. No one at all. I'd bring my friends over to play, and of course I'd destroy them because no one even knew what that game was. And I was like, oh, I wish I could find people to play Virtua Fighter with. And that's when Street Fighter 4 came out. And I ended up being kind of an 09er in a weird way because I was playing Virtua Fighter 4 and no one wanted to play Virtua Fighter 4, but people would play Street Fighter 4. And I remembered playing Street Fighter 2 as a kid, and I was like, all right, let's do this. So then I got really into Street Fighter 4, and then I got really into fighting games. And to make the long story short, I through fighting games, I kind of got into arcade games, and then through Metal Slug, I got into shmup. So it's an incredibly non-linear path to the genre.
Excellent.
And I hope that wasn't... You can cut as much of that out as you need, because that sounded really boring.
No. But what it is that people don't quite understand is in terms of... Because shmups aren't necessarily... We know as shmup fans, we can be honest. They're not necessarily top ticket games, right? No kids running in and saying, Mommy, get me Raiden. They're not doing that.
Oh, no. Kids literally don't know what shmups are. It's not even that they're not top ticket. I tested this out. I tested this theory out because I have some... Now, when I say younger, that's early 20s. So let's just keep in mind, when I say younger, I'm still talking about people in their early 20s, not even like teenagers, like
right.
People 23 and stuff like that. So I went to because my local fighting game scene has some people in their early 20s that are there, and they're cool, and I hang out with them. And I went over there and I said, okay, guys, we're gonna pop quiz, guys. What is a shmup? The closest someone got, someone did get Toho. Someone's like, oh, that's Toho. Like, hey, we got Toho. But most everyone else did not know what shmups were. That name they didn't even recognize the name. And those are people in their early 20s. So I imagine like teenagers now are probably like, what WTF's that? So
right. Well, let's see now. This creates kind of a fork in our multiverse, because I was kind of going into this sort of linearly, thinking, okay, you just touched on something that's very important in terms of marketing, because that's the next topic, is where the industry is and where it should go. I'll speak for myself. I'm able to accept that shmups aren't necessarily mainstream, and I kind of, full disclosure, I'm a dick. I'm about it. I'm an elitist. I don't care for the casuals having access to shmups. I don't really care. You couldn't pay me to care that they, oh boy, casuals can have access to shmups. I don't care about that. But that being said, it does the industry kind of suffer from that? And that plays into kind of the thesis I'm getting into, what we'll get into in the marketing. Let's just jump into that, if you don't mind, like where the industry is. First, before, and I wanted to kind of bookmark that, but now going to this next topic, where do you see the industry as it is? What do you think the industry needs? And one spin on this too, as you're thinking of the answers, I'll ask you and start this topic off. Have you ever considered yourself making a game? Like, would you be interested in making a game if you could? Like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I'm working on my own shmup right now, but it's still like I put a ton of work into it and everything. But the project I'm working on now, I have zero expectations that it will be like a sort of crossover mainstream title. So it's funny you mentioned that. This one is strictly for the homies.
Okay.
Because it goes, because the reason why I'm making the game isn't so much because I view myself as a future game designer necessarily, but it's because there's some really interesting concepts that I want to see explored that are just so esoteric and kind of not a good idea in terms of marketing, talking about marketing. So I'm just making it happen, and I just want to see what that looks like and see if these concepts work, if it doesn't, if it's a crazy idea, if it's not. So it's a little bit more experimental. So don't expect. It's not like Zero Ranger or some like mind-blowing shit or anything.
We are destined to have crossed paths on this, because that is exactly why I started making a shmup. Because there's so much in my view, and I'm sorry, I know this is my interview for you, but just really,
hey, you're the interviewer. You have the power.
Well, I'm doing a lousy job at this moment, because what I'm saying is that aligns with the thesis that I'm, in the second part of this interview, is about why it was so necessary for me to actually start trying to create a game for myself. And so you're touching on those things when you speak about, and that's, I had a strong sense of that. You're from an academic standpoint, and if anybody who actually has a chance to hear this interview, please check out the Electric Underground. There's a lot of academic discussion around what makes a game, especially if you're a burgeoning game developer or want to get in this space.
Oh yeah, definitely.
For people who don't quote, for somebody like yourself, who's not a programmer by trade, to understand the art and craft of the game is very important. People need to understand that. Let me get back to get off my soapbox and get back to the interview. So you're wanting to make a game, so now you can speak with authority on what is missing in the industry. And I'm not expecting you to expose, literally, don't expose anything, of course, about what you're doing unless you want to. But really, just
I'm an open book.
Well, the idea is that, but the direction, I'll let you talk in a moment. I'm sorry. The direction I want you to go in is, what are the things that you felt was missing in the industry that made you want to design a game? So let's start there. What's missing in today's? Yeah.
So I guess there's two answers. One I'm not addressing that I think I would love to address in the future, but I think the more mainstream path for me is through my YouTube channel rather than game programming, because I don't think I quite have the you just can't dual career that, unfortunately.
Right.
And if I was a full on YouTuber, I could like dual career trying to dev and YouTube at the same time, but I can't. But in terms of my own sort of experimentation side, so this is more on the gameplay side rather than the marketing side, is there was this brief era in shooting games and shmups, but like so shmups came from the arcades and they had that, really golden age that we all are aware of, that we're getting the Gradiuses, the Dariuses, the Raidens,
Right.
all of that shit. And then, which are fantastic. And then shmups had this very tiny period of time. I'm talking like 2 years, where they got crazy with it. They went experimental, and then that shit did not work out financially for anyone. Like even in terms of shmups, like that didn't fucking work. So shmups were like, all right, we're gonna have to pull this back together. And then we got modern Danmaku, which I love. But and then solidified into modern Danmaku and the modern Danmaku formula, which I love. But there was this tiny era of shmups where they were doing some crazy shit. And that era of shmups, I would love to pick up on some of the ideas that came out in that era that were just straight up dropped.
Give us some titles. Give us some titles.
Okay, the big one, the big mama is Guange. The big mama. Because Guange, the more I play it, the more I study that game, the more I realize how insanely experimental that game is. Because at first it just seems like another cave shmup, but it is not. It is doing all kinds of crazy shit. First of all, I just had this realization the other day. Guange is not even fully a traditional shmup. It's actually much more like a gallery shooter. Because with the Shiki mechanic, the ghost mechanic, you have full aim. Like think of Sin and Punishment.
Right.
You know how in Sin and Punishment you have the cursor and you can move it anywhere? No other shmup has that shit. Like full aim with you can move your shot and aim it because the ghost is essentially like a first-person reticle. And then on top of that, so there's that. It's not even traditional shmup shooting because you have this full control. And then on top of that, it's doing all this crazy shit with scrolling. Because Guange, a lot of shmups, they scroll horizontally or they scroll vertically. Guange gets crazy with it, and the scroll shifts all over the place. You'll be scrolling sideways, then you're scrolling up, then you're scrolling like somewhat diagonally, and then you're scrolling backwards, and then you have cover systems. No other shmups do that shit. Like you're on the ground, most shmups are in the air, you're on the ground, and you can actually like hide behind stuff and do straight up cover system bullshit. The game is absolutely wild, and Cave never followed that system up. They never made another shmup like Guange at all, and no one else followed those ideas up. So that one's the big one for me that really stands out to me. But then there's another one, and I'm sorry, I cannot for the life of me remember the title of this. I'll message you after the interview because I'm going to have to ask Boghog what it was. But it's not even fully a shmup necessarily. It's kind of like a run and gun, but then you have full gallery shooting controls, but then it also has some shmupping elements. So like the gallery shooter stuff, the Sin and Punishment stuff, I really wish that exact genre, there's like 3 titles or something. There's like 3 or 4 titles in that genre, and then it was just dropped, never to be seen again. So that's something that really fascinates me. And that's the big revision I'm doing, because when my shmup I'm working on is called House of Bullets. My first initial stuff on that was more traditional, but kind of crazy. But then I realized what I am trying to do is I'm trying to follow up on some of these mechanics. So I'm going to do kind of a revision of some of those. So it'll be a little bit more like Guange probably by the end, but with some other variations. But so that's what really fascinates me from a gameplay perspective.
Fantastic. Since you mentioned it, my game's going to be called Blasternal. We don't have to talk about that now, but that's at some point as we and I'd like to consider this a friendship, and kinship, and what we're trying to do. We'll get into that, but you be looking out for Blasternal. That's what I'm working on. So Guange's
awesome.
One, and then there's another one that you said that you'll get me later on. That's fine.
Yes, it's hella obscure. Even if I told you the name now, you would not know it because it's deeply obscure. Boghog was showing me it, and I was like, "Oh god, this is brilliant." So I'll message you what it is, though.
No problem. So what you're saying is that, and that illuminates something. I didn't know this because I was very curious. why the shooter genre, in my view, kind of hit a glass ceiling. It there's only so many things that shooter developers seem to want to try anymore.
Yeah,
and then the question
definitely.
is, why don't we see more variety? Why don't we see, which harkens into why I decided to go ahead and start developing my own game. So you feel that you want to harken back to that time of, hey, we can experiment, we can do crazy shit, and still have the twitch, still have the fast pace and density of play, as you talk about in your YouTube videos. You really strike on, in terms of gameplay, the density of gameplay.
Yes, exactly.
So then let's spin that into what you think. If hey, I'm an aspiring game developer, I'm trying to make a shmup. What advice do you have? For developers and for the market in general?
Okay, so for shmup developers or shooting game developers, running gun developers, any sort of arcade genre developer, my number one piece of advice is do not put concepts before fundamentals. I think that's the number one mistake new developers make. I kind of can fall into this myself. That's why I have to do some revisions as I'm working on my game. I'm like, okay, I need to look at the fundamentals a little bit, because the fundamentals are not pretty. They're not like flashy or catchy or interesting. But if you don't have them there, your game is just not going to have the legs to stand on. It's kind of like the difference between a great film by a brilliant filmmaker and like a amateur film from a college student. Like, you look at a lot of amateur films, I'm trying to give it a relatable example. Like, they always have these kind of like out there concepts, like, oh, what if we made a film but the camera's upside down and you're watching everything upside down, and that's a metaphor for life or something, right? But they don't actually know how to write a scene or develop a character, so
Gotcha.
you're just watching like some really bad scenes, but the camera's upside down. That happens a lot in shmups, a lot with new developers, where they think of like a really cool mechanic idea. So like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you had a shmup, but there's a sword, and then the sword can like absorb bullets, and then, but they don't have any sort of fundamental understanding of, okay, how do you put a level together? How do you scale the damage? How do you design enemies and enemy AI and that sort of thing? And so that is always my advice to new developers, is try to get an understanding of the fundamentals. And that's not pretty, but man, it's going to be the real game changer. I think a good example of this that everyone likes because they do it is treasure shmups. So Radiant Silvergun, Ikaruga. The
Yeah.
reason why those shmups work, even though they have all these out there concepts, is because Treasure at the end of the day still know how to make a fundamental solid shmup, and then they add in the mechanics on top of that. But underneath that, they're still really solid, well put together games. So that would be my advice: is try not to get too ahead of yourself with the concepts and still try to focus on the fundamentals.
That's interesting. So you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense. Treasure's a great example because, at its core, the gameplay is there. The gameplay is rock solid. It's
Yes.
You get into it like a comfortable pair of slip shoes that you should have thrown away 2 years ago, and they slide right on. And that's Treasure. And then on top of it, it's an icing on the cake proposition. By the time you get into their unique and peculiar mechanics, then you're saying, okay, well, this is really fantastic. This especially brilliant games like Ikaruga. So
Yeah, and Silvergun. And Treasure's a fantastic developer to study for this, because they have their titles where they put the concepts too forward, and you're like, all right, Treasure, let's bring it back here, okay? You're getting a little too out there, and it's not quite working. And then they have the titles where they just nail it. And so it's really fun to review Treasure games for that aspect as well, because they have that both sides, and not a lot of developers have both sides. Most developers, they're either really rock solid and they just nail the fundamentals and they're masters of that, like Cave. Though Cave gets experimental sometimes, but Cave really masters those fundamentals. And then there's other developers who they get crazy with the ideas, but sometimes the actual gameplay is a little bit funky and off. But so Treasure is just a fantastic dev to study because they do both.
Okay. And then, ending out the first part of this interview would be the question of, for the industry then, as far as the market goes, should the market be doing something different for the genre, or is it okay as it is?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So the marketing, I think, is actually much simpler than people think it is, which is that shmups have sort of surrendered a lot of potential audience to other genres, and if they really wanted, they could recapture some of this audience back if they tried. So what we see with a lot of shmups today is a sort of trying to bring the arcade era back or trying to sustain the arcade era. And I think that's a noble goal because we all love the arcade era. But I don't think that's the future of the genre because arcades are they're just kind of done. Even in Japan, sadly, they're just kind of on their way out at this point.
Interesting.
And so there's a lot of sort of rules that come with arcade game design that developers are still following to this day because it's a tradition, but they actually don't have to follow those rules anymore. They could just drop them now because your game does not need to be in an arcade. Like that's kind of a cool idea, but it doesn't matter anymore. So you actually can start doing things that the arcade wouldn't allow. This seems really basic, but it's still, I think, kind of an important one. There was this sort of rule with most arcade shmups that your game needed to have about 3 buttons, and that's kind of like the max because most arcade cabinets supported about 3 buttons.
All right.
And so a lot of shmups, even now that have like fairly complicated mechanics, still try to shove those mechanics onto 3 buttons. And then I think again, Treasure figured this out. They're like, nah, fuck this. Let's just use 6 buttons and let's get crazy with it. And so that's one thing is when you're making your shmups, I think you can be a little bit more broad with the mechanics of shmups now because you can use a real full range of buttons. You don't have to just use 3 buttons. You could use 6 buttons. That's fine. But if you talk to developers, even now, like if you go on Discord and you're like, a lot of developers will still kind of think, well, aren't shmups supposed to have just 3 buttons? So that's a very basic example. But I think that one's just really, really obvious one. Another really basic but kind of obvious one is frame rates. Most shmups are still, and I'm guilty of this with my shmup, and I'm not saying it has to change now, but if you think about it, why don't shmups run in high frame rates? Like there's no logical reason why they shouldn't, and on paper it makes 100% sense. High frame rates and shmups seem to be a marriage made in heaven, and yet shmups don't come out in high frame rates. You know, they're still mostly tied to 60 FPS.
So we ran into some technical difficulties with the audio, so here's take 2 on that last topic.
That's okay, because I think I could repeat myself better anyway. Okay. So take 2.
Yes.
So I think one obvious thing is that a lot of indie games that still come up now, or a lot of shmups that come out now, still sort of go by certain rules that were needed in the arcade, but I personally think the arcade era is pretty much over. I know that's kind of harsh to say, but even in Japan, arcades are shutting down. A real eye-opening moment for me was in Korea. A lot of the Korean arcades shut down. One of them, it's a fighting game arcade, but still was called Green Arcade, and it was like the Tekken arcade, and Tekken's a super popular game, and they shut down because they just didn't have enough revenue, and that's one of the biggest Tekken arcades in the world. And if Tekken's not making it, and I just think Japan, it'll hang in there for a while, but I don't think it's going to last forever. But in the Western world, like Europe, arcades don't even like exist in Europe. And in the US, there used to be kind of a pretty strong arcade scene, but that's mostly fallen away. And you get a little bit of like Renaissance type stuff like bar arcades and that, but they're not pulling in new shit. They're usually using like more old school games and kind of going off that, which works, but your game's not going to be one of them, right? Your shmup is not going to be hanging out in a barcade, unfortunately. So I think a lot of the rules of arcades, some of them you can just kind of drop them from your game, and it might be an interesting idea. For example, this seems super basic, but it's still sort of a rule in a lot of people's minds is you have to use about 3 buttons for your game because arcade cabinets, you kind of needed to use about 3 buttons. But nowadays, you go crazy with it. 6 buttons. You can be more experimental with your control systems now because you don't have to expect people to just play on arcade sticks as much as I love an arcade stick. Uh, and I think there's a lot of territory that shmups could start to plunge into that other genres have hopped into. Like twin stick shooters, for example, have crowded out, I think, a lot of a potential audience of shmups that shmups could go after a little bit more. In terms of why don't you make a shmup with mouse and keyboard controls, but like good ones rather than like crappy Euro schmuppy ones, like really, really good ones, and really intense level design, and keep the arcade spirit, but you don't necessarily have to be married to the exact way things were done in the arcades. Another example that seems really obvious is high frame rates. Like, doesn't that seem like a very natural fit for the genre to have higher frame rate games, less input lag, more frames to respond, smoother animations? But shmups, I'm guilty of this. So I think we all are still now, but I think that's a very strong future territory shmups could target. It's like, okay, maybe start targeting 128 FPS, start targeting variable frame rates and stuff like that, higher frame rate. I think there's a lot of really basic things shmups could start doing. Of course, graphics, I always talk about that. Like, I still don't know if we've seen a shmup post like Treasure that has really impressive graphics. Now, there's a lot of shmups out that come out today that have very nice looking, solid pixel art, and I love it. But in terms of mainstream crossover appeal, an obvious example that I always point to is like, look at what Guilty Gear did with their graphics when they came out with Xrd. That changed that franchise. Those graphics changed that franchise from a very cool but very niche fighting game series to a premier fighting game series. And now look at Strive, how successful that is. Dragon Ball Z Fighters, how successful that was. The gameplay, Fighters kind of sucks, but Strive kind of sucks. But Xrd I really like. And the gameplay of Xrd I think is still really hardcore and solid, but that those graphics really push that game to the next level. And I dream of the day I see a shmup, think of Mushihime Sama Futari tier in terms of gameplay and design, but it looks like Guilty Gear in terms of the effects and the graphics. I think that would be a game changer. And I don't think we've seen that yet. And the games that come out that try the 3D thing, like R-Type Final 2, I don't think those are particularly good looking. It always reminds me of StarCraft 2 era 3D, which I don't think is very appealing. Or maybe even get a little bit more experimental with it. Like, for example, it's not a shmup, but one game I thought was very interesting with its graphical design that came out last year. I'm going to review it here soon, is Hyper Demon. And what it was doing with its visuals. I think shmups could also start trying shit like that. Like, a little bit more out there visual styles if you don't, it's just something to get people hooked while not totally throwing off the design of the games.
Got it. Now, it's a double-edged sword when you say get away from arcade, because when you say get away from arcade, well, for one, the Midwest is behind everybody. So we've got arcades opening. Like there's one opening in Cincinnati, Ohio, Southwest Ohio.
Oh, yeah. You guys are like, yeah, if you're in the Midwest, that's like the mecca of arcade shit out there.
And so,
with Galloping Ghosts and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But Galloping Ghosts, that's a great example. But Galloping Ghosts, they bring in an insane array of arcade games, but how many of those games were made after the year 2010,
Right.
Like, and Zero Ranger is a great example of this. Is Zero Ranger going to end up in an arcade machine at any point, But at the same time, Zero Ranger is a very, very strong, faithful arcade experience in terms of the design, in terms of what it's bringing to the table, but it also is doing things that you just can't do in the arcade, like unless it had its own special cabinet. Like it has a more robust control system, more buttons are involved, the way the level design works is a little bit more Treasure inspired, a little bit more console inspired, but but it still has those roots into the level design and the boss design and enemy design. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying stuff like you throw out the core of the arcade experience, but I'm saying you can expand it. You can push it a little further.
Okay.
Like Treasure was doing, like with Radiant Silvergun and like what Zero Ranger does. It's pushing on that arcade design a little further.
So there's a sort of irony where if you're trying to pay homage too closely to the arcade trope, that you wind up creating your own glass ceiling. Is that a fair statement?
That is exactly the situation. And it's not a situation I'm super thrilled with, but that is the situation. And the moment this opened my eyes was when I think it was 2018 when Ketsui Destiny came out. Ketsui Destiny, in my opinion, is probably one of the greatest games ever. Not just in the terms of shmups, but perhaps of all time. And do you know how many people reviewed Ketsui Destiny? One, and I think it was Eurogamer. And I think the guy got in trouble for giving it a perfect score, if I remember correctly. Like the Eurogamer was like, "Why are you giving this random motherfucking game a perfect score?"
Wow.
He's like, "Well, it's a great game," but no one talked about Ketsui Destiny. It didn't change the world, but in terms of quality, in terms of absolute perfection of arcade design, I don't think you're going to top that. Same thing with the DOJ port coming out. These games, I don't think you're going to top them in terms of the arcade experience brought to modern systems. It's like perfect. And yet, is that sales wise, crossover wise, audience wise? They're just not bringing in that crossover audience like Zero Ranger possibly could, or those types of games. So that's what I mean. I'm not saying you throw that out the window, but I'm just saying if you want to expand your audience, you're gonna have to push on the arcade design a little bit, expand it a little bit.
Do you think that's part of the end game? The part of the end game is to expand the audience. Now, again, I'm speaking for myself. I'm a purist. I'm a snob. I'm an elitist. I don't care about the casuals. I'm not. I get it. They got plenty of games. That's how I feel. You guys have a plethora of games. Don't come over here, making my genre are all accessible and frou-frou and all that crap. But is that also creating a glass ceiling in your point? And that it's insensitive, but is that also sort of a glass ceiling when there's that elitism saying, well, we don't want the casuals? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought about this a lot because in my heart I can be quite snobby and quite picky. But it's not just a matter of appealing to casuals. And I hope I may have said this at some point, somewhere, I can't remember. But it's not just a matter of casuals. It's a matter, think of it kind of more economically. That's how I view it. In order for like a pyramid, in order for those hardcore releases to survive, in order for the Ketsui Destinies to be feasible, and the only reason Ketsui, in my opinion, the only reason M2 shot triggers exist is because it's this little top of a pyramid sitting on top of the beast that is M2. And the revenue M2 pulls in, like all the revenue, are from the casuals. They're not pulling in, I don't think, any revenue on these shot trigger ports. They might be losing money with them. And you can kind of tell, if you watch that interview that My Life in Gaming did with the shot triggers team, I kind of pick up on the vibe that they're doing this. And like the boss is like, I am doing this strictly to appease these motherfuckers because this is making us absolutely no money. But think about it, like you need the casuals to feed the ecosystem so that the more elite shit has an environment to exist in.
Yeah.
Because what we're seeing happening, it happened with Cave. Cave's a great example of this. Is if you go up and up and up and up and up and up, and there's no casuals at the bottom of it, it just drops and crashes. It can't sustain itself economically. And so if you have a bigger pyramid of players, casuals eating at the bottom, what the casuals can do, and this is what casuals are great for, fighting games absolutely rely on this, is the casuals will buy like if you get enough casuals in there and they're somewhat aware of the genre, they will actually buy Ketsui Destiny. Now, will they play and get 2-alls and be world record holders or be competitive? No, but they will actually still buy that. But they're not going, but you can't go from I'm playing Super Mario World to I'm buying Ketsui Destiny. Like there needs to be sort of that trail to it.
Right.
And so I think it's like an ecosystem. And so shmups are very unique though. Like no other genre has this. Shmups have this insanely unique problem where most genres have a bunch of crappy casual games and very few really good hardcore titles. Shmups are like the weird inversion of that. Shmups have an insane array of amazingly good games, quality-wise, gameplay-wise, but very little crossover content. So they're kind of just stuck out on this island. And so it just, I think, is a natural area that the genre could expand outward to. Because I don't think you were going to go any further in terms of amazing arcade design. I think that those heights are going to be really hard to cross at this point, crossing over what Rising have done, even Crimson Clover World Ignition. Like, you can make games along those lines, but I think crossing over them is going to be very difficult. And I'm not even sure you're going to get rewarded for doing that. Like, even if the greatest shmup ever made came out in 2022, I don't think it would be financially successful. Instead, I think the more crossover title would be successful.
Right.
And so that's I'm just saying purely marketing wise, I think that would be the smart direction for the genre to push out towards, is trying to bridge into the twin stick shooter type audience, bridge into those types of audiences. There was this game that came out that seems to be on the rage right now. It's called Vampire Savior or something. And it's like the most Euro shmup thing I've ever seen in my life. But at the same time, it's like, well, if there's clearly some type of audience here. If shmups could capture it, could go in and invade and kind of take it over and be like, okay, you want Vampire Saviors? Here's some real shit here. We're gonna take that idea, but we're gonna get rid of all the Euro shmup crap, and we're gonna make it like the real deal.
Right.
So I think there's room there. So that would be my thoughts.
No, real quick, you harken on something that's very interesting. You say Euro game in your YouTube. You talk about Euro shmups.
Yeah.
Versus no, and that's fine. That part of the people don't understand how nuanced the genre is. The genre has a lot of nuance to it that a lot of casual gamers, again, people from outside the love of the genre, don't really get. They think, oh, shooter, okay, well, what, Defender? You know, they get cynical about it. And it's
it's a very simple genre. They think it's like, I think a lot of people view shmups as like baby's first genre. Like, oh, okay, you're gonna learn how to make a shmup because you're just learning how to program, and then when you become a big boy, you can make a open world, what do they call them? Metroidvania. No, that's what the big boys make. You know, that you're a grown up when you make a Metroidvania. And when you make a shmup, you're just kind of learning and it's basic.
Right.
It's kind of archaic. It's kind of like cave painting shit, but just to help you learn. And what I don't think a lot of casual players understand, especially with the really, really top shelf shmups, is there is a lot of sophistication. And I'm not just saying this in like a abstract way. I mean like literal lines of code. Like under the hood, these things have a lot of shit going on.
Right.
It's just the way the games are programmed is all that shit going on under the hood is supposed to be going on. It's like a Porsche, right? Like when you drive a Porsche, or I'm not a good car person, but like a supercar, you get in the driver's seat, you know the car goes 200 miles an hour. You have no idea exactly how that car is going 200 miles an hour, but you know that it is. Shmups are like that. Like a really good shmup is going 200 miles an hour, and you're not exactly sure what's making it do that, but it turns out it's a lot of stuff that's very sophisticated.
Right. A lot of things that people really can't appreciate. And again, that goes back to what I said about how shmups did push the other genres when it came to arcade hardware and home console hardware. People don't realize the benchmark was a shmup. And there's a little bit of what you said. We're trying to train our developers, and we're trying to get them to understand the hardware, so we're going to give them a shmup so they can learn how to program for the the Sega Saturn or the Dreamcast, these next generation consoles. And by the way, along comes Square with a game called Einhander for the PlayStation 1 and blows everybody away. Nobody expected that. Square was they were the RPG guys, and they come out with Einhander and completely blow everybody's minds. And it's as late in the game console's life cycle.
That's the era I'm talking about. I was talking about earlier in the interview about that short experimental era of shmups. That was a few years, kind of the PS1 era.
Right.
Only in that era would you have Square make a shmup.
Yep.
That only happened one time, and it happened in that era. So Einhander is a good example of that.
So I'm going to go ahead and close out this first part of the interview. Thank you for that. I want to thank you for your time, Mark. I appreciate it. Everybody, when you get a chance, check out the Electric Underground on YouTube. Mark, thank you for your time.
No problem. It's a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you. You have a great evening.
Adios, everyone.